This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1. Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1 was released in 2004 by Multiman Publishing and Avalon Hill, and designed by Ken Dunn. This game supports 2 players, and each scenario takes approximately 2 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1. In this episode, we're going to cover the last 2 phases of the sequence of play, beginning with the Advance phase. In this phase, the attacker's units may transfer support weapons amongst themselves and move into an adjacent hex space. This includes moving into a hex space occupied by enemy units, which will lead us into the close combat phase. Before we jump into that, though, let's take a closer look at the Advance phase. Similar to the Rally phase, in the Advance phase, the attacker may transfer support weapons between good order unpinned units. The process and etiquette for this mirrors what we've covered previously. Once any transfer of support weapons is completed, good order unpinned infantry units may advance into an adjacent hex, even if occupied by enemy units. If the unit advances into an enemy-occupied hex, though, be sure to add a close combat marker to the unit. This will remind players that close combat needs to be resolved in the next phase. Before we move on, let's look at some notes regarding portage and exhaustion. Advancing into a hex that uses all of its movement factors becomes exhausted. Place a CX marker on these units. For example, a Russian squad carrying a 5 portage point medium machine gun moves into a building or woods hex. This would exhaust the unit. Be aware, though, an already exhausted unit may not enter a hex if it costs all of their movement factors. And with that said, we're on to the next phase. Now, back at our sequence of play slide, we finally made it to the last phase, for close combat. In this phase, we're going to resolve all units on the board that occupy the same hex and are thus engaged in close combat. Close combat in the Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit is much simpler than full ASL. However, there is still some complexity here. Therefore, let's begin with some basic information on how close combat works, and then we'll jump into the more complex versions. First, let's discuss close combat eligibility and some rule changes for this form of combat. As we just covered, close combat is a type of attack that occurs during the close combat phase between opposing units in the same hex. Keep in mind, though, close combat is not solely triggered just by a unit entering an enemy-occupied hex. Close combat can span multiple turns. Players keep track of this with a double-sided marker with melee printed on one side and CC for close combat on the other. The CC side is used to remind players that close combat needs to be resolved during the close combat phase. However, if close combat does not result in the elimination of one side occupying the hex, then the marker is flipped over to the melee side. Units will be locked in melee until the next close combat phase, when the marker is then flipped over to the CC side to make another attempt at close combat. Some other rules to keep in mind with close combat. There are no terrain effect modifiers to a close combat attack dice roll, and neither support weapons nor point-blank fire apply. Now, there are 2 types of close combat in the starter kit. Simultaneous close combat, this is where both sides attack each other at the same time, and then remove any casualties. And sequential close combat, which is triggered with an ambush in either a woods or a building hex. To determine an ambush, both players roll a single 6-sided die. The player with the lowest die result is the ambusher, and to successfully ambush, the die result must be 3 less than their opponent. Then, the ambusher resolves their attack, removes any casualties, and then any survivors can battle back. Next, let's work our way through a simple, simultaneous close combat example, and then we'll try a sequential one. Let's walk through how to calculate and resolve an instance of close combat. At the bottom of the ASL Starter Kit Quick Reference data card included in the game is the close combat table and the ambush table. You will need both of these tables to resolve any close combat that occurs in this phase. Let's focus in on this section to see how it works. Now that we have our tables, we're going to work through some of the close combat examples from the rulebook. Now, in my opinion, the examples presented here are a little too highly summarized and gloss over a lot of the pertinent details for new players. Therefore, I've organized this process into steps. Just to be clear though, these are my own steps to work through the process. You won't find this in the rulebook. We're going to break this down into sections. The first is for the close combat situation setup. And our first step is to identify the opposing units in the same hex space. Close combat instances are handled one at a time. The attacking player, the one whose turn it is, chooses the order in which they're resolved. So we're going to focus in on this one right here. We can identify this as a close combat because when the German 467 in hex G6 advanced into hex F5 occupied by a Russian 426, opposing sides occupy the same hex and will therefore engage in close combat. The German unit's advance is represented by a yellow arrow. And when this happened back in the advance phase, the units in the hex should have been marked with a close combat or CC marker. In the next step, players need to determine if there's eligibility for an ambush attempt. Ambush attempts can be made if the hex contains woods or a building. An ambush attempt can occur here because the occupied hex contains a building. In part 2 of this close combat instance, we're now going to determine if an ambush occurs and who is the ambusher. For this part, we're going to need the ambush table. To make an ambush attempt, both players roll one 6-sided die. If one player's die result is less than their opponent's die result by at least 3, then they're the ambusher and the ambush is successful. In the first step though, we need to determine any die roll modifiers that may apply for each side. These modifiers account for situations where units may be inexperienced, pinned, CX or exhausted, or there's leadership involved. In our example for the German unit, there are no applicable die roll modifiers to apply. However, for the Russian unit, there is a +1 because the 426 unit is a conscript. In other words, they're inexperienced. And then, in the next step, each side rolls one 6-sided die and applies any die roll modifiers. The German player receives a die result of 2 with no modifiers. The Russian player's die result is a 2, which is modified by a +1 die roll modifier to become a 3. In step 3, compare the difference between die results to see if one side is at least 3 less than the other. The German player's lower die result of 2 makes them the ambusher, compared to the Russian die result of 3. However, the lower die result from the German player is not at least 3 less than the Russian player, therefore the ambush fails. Next, in part 3, we're going to resolve close combat. In step 1, we're going to determine the odds ratio for each side's close combat strength. This time we're going to need the close combat table. In particular, pay attention to the odds ratio row. Now, for the German close combat odds ratio, compare the German unit's firepower of 4 to the Russian unit's firepower of 4. The odds ratio of the German unit winning close combat is 1-to-1. Then you're going to do the same calculation for the Russian side. But remember, you need to reverse the firepower, so the Russian units comes first. And yes, they're the same here, but later on, when you have multiple units involved, you need to make sure you get the order correct. So the Russian unit also has an odds ratio of 1-to-1. Now obviously, this is really simple. For more complex comparisons, if you're not an odds expert, there are several tables online that will help you with this calculation. And then in step 2, on the close combat table, using each side's odds ratio, identify their kill number. Now remember, in other close combats, these odds ratios may be different. But once you've mapped the odds ratio to the table, then just look at the kill number row beneath it. Therefore, for the German kill number, the odds ratio is 1-to-1, which equals a kill number of 5. For the Russian kill number, it's the same. The odds ratio is also 1-to-1, which equals a kill number of 5. The kill number is what each player will try to roll against to kill their opponent. Therefore, in step 3, each side identifies any dice roll modifiers that would impact their dice result. These die roll modifiers are listed at the bottom of the table. They account for situations where the unit is broken, pinned, there's a leader involved, or it's exhausted. There is also a die roll modifier here for a successful ambush attempt. We'll cover a successful ambush and sequential close combat in a later example. In this example, there are no die roll modifiers, so both the German side and the Russian side are 0. Then, in step 4, each side rolls 2 6-sided dice against their identified kill number, and then adds their modifiers. Keep in mind, there are 3 outcomes for each player's dice roll. If the dice result is below the kill number, then their opponent's units are eliminated. If the dice result is at the kill number, then casualty reduce 1 randomly selected unit from the opponent's side. If the dice result is above the kill number, then there is no effect. In this example, the German player rolls a 5 versus their kill number of 5. The dice result is equal to the kill number, which results in a casualty reduction. The Russian player rolls a 9 versus their kill number of 5. The dice result is above the kill number, which equals no effect. Next, in step 5, apply the close combat results. For Germany, the Russian results have no effect on their units. But for Russia, the Russian 4-2-6 squad is reduced to a 2-2-6 half squad. Remember, if there were multiple units in the group, this would be determined by random selection. Then finally, we're in part 5, Close Combat Cleanup. In this sole step, we need to review hex occupancy and manage the close combat/melee counter. In our example, opposing forces still reside in the same hex. Therefore, we're going to flip the close combat counter over to its melee side, and all units will remain locked in melee until the next close combat phase. Keep in mind, while in melee, new units may advance into the melee hex, but must engage in close combat in the next close combat phase. Also keep in mind that units outside the hex may attack the melee units during a fire phase, but remember, all friendly and enemy units in the melee hex must be attacked. Remove the melee counter as soon as no unbroken unit remains. If after close combat only one side remains, then remove the close combat counter. Next, we're going to take a look at the 7th close combat example from the rulebook, which is located right here on the map. Let's work our way through each part of the process. Starting with part 1, the close combat situation setup. In step 1, we're going to identify the opposing units in the same hex space. When the German 4-6-7 squad in hex J4 advanced into hex I4 occupied by a Russian 4-4-7 squad, opposing sides occupy the same hex and will engage in close combat. The units in the hex are marked with a close combat marker. In step 2, we determine eligibility for an ambush attempt. An ambush can occur because the occupied hex, I4, contains a building. Okay, now we're at Part 2, Ambush Determination. Step 1. Determine any die roll modifiers for each side. To check for this, we reference the ambush table. For the German player, there are no applicable die roll modifiers to apply. The Russian player also has no applicable die roll modifiers to apply. In Step 2, each side rolls one 6-sided die and applies any DRMs. The German die result is 4, and the Russian die result equals 1. In Step 3, compare the difference between the die results to see if one side is at least 3 less than the other. In our example, the lower Russian die result of 1 makes them the ambusher, compared to the German die result of 4. The difference of 3 between the die results triggers a successful ambush. Now we're officially in sequential combat. This means that the Russian ambusher gets to make their attack first. If the attack results in casualties, they are removed, and then, if there are any survivors, the German player gets to battle back. Let's call this Part 3B, Resolve Ambush. In Step 1, determine the odds ratio for the ambusher. We're going to need the close combat table for this. Now we're going to calculate the Russian ambusher's close combat odds ratio. We're looking at the Russian 447 squad versus the German 467 squad. Therefore, compare the Russian firepower of 4 to the German firepower of 4. The odds ratio for this is 1:1. In Step 2, on the close combat table, identify the ambusher's kill number. With an odds ratio of 1:1, this equals a kill number of 5. In Step 3, the ambusher identifies any dice roll modifiers that would impact their results. The Russian has a dice roll modifier for the ambush of -1. After that, in Step 4, the ambusher rolls 2 6-sided dice against their kill number and adds any modifiers. The Russian rolls a 6, reduced by a -1 DRM, to a 5 versus their kill number of 5. The dice result is at the kill number, which results in a casualty reduction. Then, in Step 5, we apply the close combat results. So the German player being ambushed, their 467 squad is reduced to a 247 half squad. Now in the next part, we're going to resolve the close combat from the ambush survivors. In Step 1, determine the odds ratio for the survivors. Calculate the German ambusher's close combat odds ratio. The German 247 half squad versus the Russian 447 squad. Compare the German firepower of 2 to the Russian firepower of 4. The odds ratio is 1:2. Then, in Step 2, on the close combat table, identify the survivor's kill number. For the German kill number, the odds ratio is 1:2, which equals a kill number of 4. In Step 3, identify any dice roll modifiers that would impact the survivor's close combat dice result. The German has a dice roll modifier for being ambushed of +1. In Step 4, the ambush survivor rolls 2 6-sided dice against their kill number and adds any modifiers. The German player rolls a 4, increased by a +1 DRM to 5, versus their kill number of 4. The dice result is no effect. After that, we skip to Part 5, Close Combat Cleanup. In Step 1, review the hex occupancy and manage the close combat melee counter. Opposing forces still reside in the same hex. Therefore, flip the close combat counter to its melee side. All units will remain locked in melee until the next close combat phase. And that concludes our example for sequential close combat. And this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of the series, we're going to look at more advanced forms of close combat, which involves multiple units and leaders. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.